Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire promoted by Glenlivet Books. Today, I want to focus on two aspects of the Prime Minister's recent visit to the United States, which haven't got the attention they deserve. Has the creation of AUKUS diminished the importance of Quad because Quad is no longer at the core of the United States' Indo-Pacific concerns? It's now been replaced by AUKUS. And secondly, does the creation of AUKUS suggest that America and India view the Chinese threat as related in different geographies? America sees it primarily in the Indo-Pacific. India sees it far more certainly west of the country. Those are the two key issues I shall raise today with India's former Foreign Secretary, former Ambassador to the United States, and the former Ambassador to China, Nirupama Rao. Mrs. Rao, let's start with Quad. Its first in-person summit happened days after the creation of AUKUS, and many people believe that AUKUS has demoted or at least diminished the importance of Quad because Quad is no longer at the core of the United States' concerns with the Indo-Pacific. It's now been replaced by AUKUS. How do you respond to that view?
Well, if I were to give you a frank and candid answer to your question, Karan, I would say that there's been a sort of strategic ambush of Quad by AUKUS. By that, I don't mean that the aims of the two groupings are contradictory or somehow a note of dissonance has been sounded. Although to the unschooled observer, you might well draw the conclusion that why AUKUS when Quad was gathering momentum, when you had the first in-person summit in these COVID times of Quad, and over the last few months, Quad has been accruing much more substance and has been going forth into fields of cooperation, dialogue, and coordination that originally had not been envisaged to be a part of Quad. Having said that, the AUKUS obviously is a clearly strategic alliance. And what is the purpose of the alliance? The alliance is essentially to sound out to China that you have this alliance, a trilateral alliance of three countries in the Anglosphere, Anglophone countries who already have a strong bedrock of military and strategic and intelligence cooperation between themselves. So the AUKUS, in a sense, has been an organic outflow from that sort of cooperation, that bedrock that I referred to. But certainly the question now before us is whether Quo Vadis Quad.
Let me pursue that by raising two concerns that the creation of AUKUS seems to have highlighted. First of all, AUKUS clearly suggests that not only is the United States' relationship with Australia different, but probably on a higher level than the relationship with either Japan or India. Would you agree with that perception?
Well, Karan, I think it's got a lot to do with the dragon in the room, which is China. And China clearly, by its steps, its missteps, you may say, and its actions in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, particularly, at the core or the heart of the region, its actions have certainly not inspired confidence or a sense of security for any of us. And particularly, I think after the US withdrew, I'm not explaining why the US should have done this, but after the US withdrawal, some people call it a spectacle of surrender in Afghanistan, the question was raised, what is the US going to do about the Indo-Pacific? What is its future strategy? And somehow AUKUS seems to have been timed in many ways.
I will definitely come to China because I think one of the key concerns AUKUS raises is the different way in which India and America perceive the security threat from China. But let's for a moment focus on this first concern. Do you think that by elevating the relationship to Australia to a level where Australia gets nuclear submarine technology, a distinction has been drawn between Australia on the one hand and other Quad partners like Japan and India?
Well, the distinction certainly exists, and I would be remiss in not admitting that. But let me also underline the fact that Australia is already a major strategic defense ally of the United States. And the decision, obviously, to share nuclear submarine propulsion technology with Australia, in a sense, stems from that level of trust and security that exists between the two nations. I would also like to add that Australia has somehow pivoted in a way from a position that it held very, very clearly for so many years, the way it handled China, the way its relations with China were transacted. And again, the Chinese-Australian relationship has sunk to a nadir, I would say, in the last few months, and particularly, I would say in the last couple of years. Was Australia left with no other alternative but to seek a much stronger iteration of its relationship, security relationship with the United States, is the question I would ask of you.
That may well be true, but let me bring the focus back on India. As Abhijit Singh, writing in the Hindu just a couple of days, points out, India too would welcome US nuclear submarine technology. And it's no secret that our indigenous submarine program is badly in need of a high-powered reactor. We're not able to get one, we're not able to develop one. An American reactor would suit our purposes. But America, after signing the deal with Australia, has indicated this is a one-off. So no matter how much we may want it or need it, that door seems to have been closed. It was opened for Australia, but it's firmly shut in our face.
Well, Karan, doors are never closely shut or widely open in geopolitics. And I think, first of all, I'd like to say that the India-US relationship and where it stands today, the position in which it is today, is a good position, a forward-looking, forward-oriented position. The US and India are major defense partners. We are tier one defense partners of the US, and we have a very strong interlocking defense and security relationship with the United States that goes far, far beyond any definitions of how we looked at such defense and security relationships in the past, even with the erstwhile Soviet Union or with Russia today.
All of that is true. All of that is true, but surely a distinction has been drawn between India and Japan on the one hand and Australia. And as I said, we would welcome, we would want, perhaps we would need American nuclear submarine technology, but it's not going to be available to us, because if it's a one-off deal with Australia, that is a polite indication this is Australia specific. It doesn't apply to Quad.
Well, I wouldn't draw such doomsday conclusions, Karan. It may be true that the US is not in a position or has not indicated any clear willingness or intention to provide similar technology to India if it seeks it. But at the same time, you notice that we've had meetings with France after AUKUS was announced. And France initially, when it signed that submarine deal with the Australians, initially was willing to provide them with the technology, the nuclear submarine propulsion technology that France felt should have, but it was the Australians who had refused it. Australia changed its mind. Minds change in geopolitics. Decisions are altered. Okay. And who knows, the discussions we have with France on such issues may develop, may evolve. Who knows what the outcome will be? So I would
absolutely,
I would say this is the final chapter in any way.
But Mrs. Rao, now you're trying to restore the balance between the allies, which the United States has quite clearly, I won't say destroyed, but altered, by talking about who knows what happens in the future. We don't know what happens in the future, but it's possible that the future could be worse, not better. Let me just leave it at that. But let me raise a second concern, why in fact there seems to be a differentiation in the allies in Quad. Japan too has a special military relationship with America. It's very much under the American nuclear umbrella. Now, if you look at it in that light, doesn't it seem that of the three allies in Quad, India is the least close? And yet Quad's official title is Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And yet of those three, India is the least close.
I think that, if you're going to introduce that kind of gradation in who's close the old game that people play, he loves me not. That's not how geopolitics is transacted. And I believe with Japan and with India, the situation really calls upon us as major powers situated geographically in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's Japan or India, to more closely coordinate our positions as we look to the future of Indo-Pacific geopolitics, the rise of China, the role that China is going to play in our individual relations with China.
Yeah.
I think for us, the calibration process for countries like Japan and India is far, far more sensitive, far, far more evolved and delicate than it is for other countries in the region. And we must look to what ASEAN is doing, for instance. Now, look at the reaction of the ASEAN countries to AUKUS.
No, let's not, because that's not our subject. Let's not go off to ASEAN. That would be a deflection. Let's stick to the central issue that I'm discussing, which is whether AUKUS has demoted or made the Quad less important. We've talked about the change in the relationship of the allies with the United States. Let's come to the concern that you were bringing up earlier, China, and I stopped you at that point. Let's take it up now. Doesn't AUKUS more or less pretty clearly suggest that America believes the real Chinese threat is located in the Indo-Pacific and not west of India? And that, in a sense, is underlined by America's withdrawal from Afghanistan. For India, on the other hand, the real Chinese threat, the one that's really important, is west of us and to our north on our border. And therefore, this difference of perception in terms of where the Chinese threat is located is another clear sign that there isn't congruence between the two countries' security interests, at least over the way China is perceived.
Well, Karan, I think when it comes to the definition of the Indo-Pacific, however much you may refer to the US as being only concerned about the situation in the Western Pacific or in the Pacific as it abuts our region, I would differ with your definition, because the Indo-Pacific is very much an organically interconnected region. And when you look at the Straits of Malacca, for instance, and the South China Sea, it is as important to us from the security point of view as the channels of communication, the sea lanes of communication from our western coastal borders, looking towards the east coast of Africa and to the Gulf region. So for India, and I believe for the US as a close strategic partner of India, it is equally important. Just look at the volumes of maritime trade, of energy trade that goes through this region, and the position of India in this part of the world. Not for a moment.
Not for a moment am I denying that the Indo-Pacific doesn't have critical security concerns for India. I'm simply saying that in terms of which is the greater Chinese threat, for America now it is clearly located in the Indo-Pacific. For India, the greater threat is on our northern border and to our west. And if you look at America's response to that, not only has it withdrawn from Afghanistan, but something else has thereafter become apparent. For America, the key concern is now ISIS, not Taliban. And America would be perhaps happy to take Taliban help and support in tackling ISIS. We wouldn't perceive the situation in that way at all. That's another measure of difference between us.
Well, I'm not here to accentuate the difference or what you refer to as the perception of difference between India and the United States. We have a very mature, grown-up relationship with the United States. I'm not saying that there are areas of very, very concrete and staring difference between India and the US when it comes to, what is happening in Afghanistan or how the US views the threat from China. The fact is that India has both continental concerns vis-a-vis China, the neighbor with whom we share such a very long land border, but also our coastal and our maritime strategies require equal focus and equal concentration. Just look at the length of our coastline. I was speaking to one of our retired Navy officers the other day, and he brought up a very interesting point. It's not just, the fact that we have this God-given coastline and, we look out across the Indian Ocean. There's the whole question of the security of this coastline. How are we going to develop and lessen the vulnerabilities?
Absolutely. But surely
that requires us to pay.
Surely, Mrs. Rao, you would agree.
Coordination with the United States is equally important in this.
But surely you would agree that in terms of the security of our coastline, the threat from China is not as great as the threat from China across the 3,500 miles of our northern border and to the west of our country. I'm not taking the name Pakistan, Afghanistan, but that's the area I talk about. In terms of evaluating the two threats, America sees the Indo-Pacific as the center and location of the Chinese threat they are most concerned about. We see the northern border and the west of our country as the location of the Chinese threat we are most concerned about. And it's that difference. No doubt we handled it maturely and wisely. I'm not saying this is going to lead to discord, but that is something AUKUS has shown up. It wasn't so apparent earlier, but AUKUS and the combination of the withdrawal from Afghanistan has now made it clear that we perceive the location of the Chinese threat differently.
Well, first of all, Karan, let me say that the announcement of AUKUS and all the developments that have surrounded it, I don't believe it is a bad development for India. It's not a bad development when the definition of the Chinese threat, even if we don't voice it in those terms, is more precise and looks to how we are going to deal with that threat across the region. I don't believe we must see this as the end of the world. It is true that the threat we face on our land borders, to take up your point, from China is very real. We cannot underemphasize it or de-emphasize it. What I'm saying is, even as we continue to deal with that threat and to seek a de-escalation and a disengagement with China, and to look at how we are able to restore an equilibrium in that relationship, we cannot afford to neglect our priorities and the challenges that we face in the maritime environment. And I'm not just, please let me complete. It's not just about the coastline defense. You didn't allow me to finish that argument. It's more about the whole strategy towards the Indian Ocean, the further development of the extensive maritime level naval contacts that we have across the region, which is an asset, let me say, to our strategic partners like Australia, like Japan, like the United States, and even the United Kingdom. And I would include France in that connection.
But I take the point you're making, and yet the important thing is that the Malabar naval exercises, which comprise exactly the same people as Quad, are not part of Quad, and they're consciously and deliberately separated from Quad. And that in a turn makes clear the point that in terms of security, Quad has been diminished. And I'll point it out one more way for you. Just look at the 6-page joint statement issued by the 4 Quad leaders. 5.5 pages were devoted to the pandemic and vaccines, the climate crisis, emerging technologies, infrastructure, and STEM fellowships. If I'm correct, 1 paragraph is devoted to Afghanistan and terror. That itself establishes the priorities of Quad. Afghanistan and terror are not the top priority.
Well, but I read the document a little differently from you, and I put a lot of my attention, I concentrated a lot of my attention on the penultimate paragraphs. You may say that the number of words accorded to that in the statement may be less than the rest when they talk about vaccine diplomacy and cooperation. But, the announcement about the STEM fellowships, the announcement about cooperation in critical technologies and infrastructure, and there is a way forward that has been articulated in that statement. And it's this grand coalescence convergence, which I've been talking of in other things I've written, in technology has become such an important facet of geopolitics today. It's not just about exercising in different oceans.
Undoubtedly, but it has nothing.
It's much more than that, Karan.
But it has nothing to do with our key concern of the Chinese northern border of Afghanistan and Taliban in the West. That, in terms of Quad's priorities, is right at the bottom, relegated to one paragraph. And that's what I'm pointing out, that Quad reflects the American belief that China's presence in the Indo-Pacific is the key threat, whereas ours is that China's presence on our northern border, the problem with Ladakh, the disputed border, the involvement with Taliban and Afghanistan are our bigger concerns. I'm not saying the Indo-Pacific isn't a key concern, but what I'm pointing out is that in terms of the weightage we give, there's a difference between America's perception and India's perception. They give greater weightage to the Indo-Pacific, we give greater weightage to the north and the west of the country. The perception and therefore the congruence of security interests has altered.
Karan, I believe the underlying factor is the reality of strategic convergence between democracies such as India and the United States. Never mind that you talked about our concerns along the land border with China. Yes, it's a real concern, a large concern, a continuing challenge. I don't deny that. And it's something that we will have to resolve on our own. Let me ask you a question. Have we ever gone to the Quad with a litany of complaints about what China is doing to us on our land borders? We have consistently maintained that we are discussing this with China. We are connecting with China in terms of how we resolve this. We haven't asked for help from others.
Mrs. Rao,
the overall question of the rise of China in the region is something that occupies all of us as members of the Quad.
Mrs. Rao, we didn't recognize Quad as Quad by name until very recently. We never referred to it as Quad until I think roughly 8, 9, 10 months ago. But let's leave this subject aside. I think we spent a lot of time airing different views. The audience will now decide for themselves how they want to view the situation, to what extent has AUKUS diminished Quad. But let me ask one last question before I move. Because right at the beginning you said, let's be frank and candid, there's been a strategic ambush of Quad by AUKUS. Do you want to explain that briefly, a little further, but briefly?
Well, I think the three countries involved kept it to themselves. There was very little disclosure, at least to the best of my knowledge. So I don't believe any of our thinkers, our specialists, those who write and speak on these issues had foretold this development. And it had, as I said, a lot to do with Australia and its attitude to China, and also China's own actions in the region. Perhaps we should have seen it coming. We should perhaps see more of these things happening in the future as the lines of confrontation between...
Is that a lapse on our part not to have seen it coming?
No, I don't see it as a lapse on our part. I certainly do not see it as a lapse on our part. I think we were very, very alert to the situation in the Indo-Pacific. You know, the levels of dialogue, the areas we are covering have all evolved in the last couple of years. So I don't believe we can attribute it to a lapse, either on the part of India or Japan or the countries that were not included in it.
Let's then at this point come to the second big subject I want to raise, connected with the Prime Minister's recent visit to America, which I don't think has got the attention it deserves in the media, particularly after he returned. The Prime Minister may have called India the mother of all democracies when he was speaking to the UN General Assembly, but how do you view the very pointed comments made about democracy, the need to protect the principles of democracy, the need to protect the institutions of democracy, made to the Prime Minister, both by President Biden and perhaps more importantly by Vice President Harris, and in her case, the points were made in public. How do you view them?
Well, this has been spoken of for some time now, Karan, especially since the advent of the Biden presidency. and the references that have arisen, that have surfaced from time to time about the question of democracy, about the operation of democracy, about the way pluralism and diversity are being handled. Now, this is an ongoing debate between India and the United States. The United States, I don't want to sound, as if I'm in a bully pulpit myself, but the US itself has problems in the field, has had issues. The January 6th events around the Capitol and the level of vitriol and toxicity in the debate on these issues within the United States is a phenomenon that you cannot discount. I believe that between India and the United States, given the fact that we are partners, democratic partners, debate and discussion on such issues should be allowed. I think we should be able to address what the US tells us in these issues.
I'm interrupting you because this is more than... No, Mrs. Rao, I'm interrupting you because this is more than debate and discussion between two friends. And I noticed that you began by half suggesting, though you didn't use the phrase, how dare the pot call the kettle black. But let's leave that aside. Many would counter that by saying America has a capacity to right its wrongs far more effectively, far more openly, far more publicly, far more honestly than India has shown. But let's leave that aside. I'm going to quote instead precisely what Vice President Harris said in public, and I keep repeating in public, not behind closed doors, to Mr. Modi's face. It is imperative that we defend democratic principles and institutions within our respective countries, and we maintain what we must do to strengthen democracies at home. It is incumbent on our nations to, of course, protect democracies in the best interests of our countries. That wasn't just said politely, which it was. It was also very pointedly saying, you're falling short. And I know that it's been debated and discussed that the Biden administration will make this point. But up till now, the Biden administration hadn't made it. Now the president made it, and the vice president did it in public.
I don't look at it that way. I think the references made by Vice President Kamala Harris is a kind of an omnibus statement, I would say. It was equally addressed to an American audience as much as it was, as you have said, and I admit, to an Indian audience also. I think this is something we should be able to take in the stride as we see this relationship between India and the United States grow, evolve, develop, become much more mature.
Can I ask you something?
We should understand that.
Can you ever believe that Biden and Harris would use these words to Suga of Japan or Scott Morrison of Australia? They are Quad partners. And let me tell you, when Biden, during the closed door meeting, for the start, as you know, it was public, the journalists were there. He began by welcoming what he called 4 great democracies. And that's the sole reason India is there, because we are seen, and I'm putting that word seen in quotations, to be a democracy. But progressively, the spread of Hindutva, the treatment of minorities, the weakening of institutions in India like the Election Commission and the enforcement agencies, the intimidation of the press, and even the declining relevance of parliament or the increasing politicization of our armed forces, all of that draws question marks over our credibility as a democracy. And if those questions grow, our relevance to Quad diminishes.
Well, Karan, I'm not a card-carrying member of the Indian establishment. I'm a retired official. I'm an ordinary citizen now. The very fact that you are able to voice these sentiments in an open channel of communication, I believe, conveys a message. It conveys a message that despite the fact that the factors you referred to, whether it's the rise of Hindutva, whether it's the change in the political climate, all that be that as it may, you are still able to voice these ideas, voice these thoughts.
Mrs. Rao,
there is a debate.
Mrs.
And I
Rao.
believe that is, let me finish, Karan. I've allowed you to say what you had to. Let me finish what I have to. The very fact that you and I are sitting here discussing these issues, we're not Xi Jinping's China. We are the world's biggest democracy, and we stay that way. It's not just the fact that we conduct elections. There are self-correcting...
Can I interrupt? Because you're drawing comfort from the fact...
even the Americans recognize.
Mrs. Rao, can I interrupt? You're drawing comfort from the fact that you and I can carry on questioning the government and criticizing the government, and neither of us is arrested for sedition. However, you're forgetting that 2 young people in the Northeast who simply said that Gau Mutra is not a cure for COVID were done for sedition and arrested for 3 months and not let out into the Supreme Court did. You're forgetting that Sadiq Hapan, who was simply traveling to UP to investigate the rape, the hideous rape of a young girl, was arrested before he got there, before he wrote a story. And there are multiple such instances, not one, multiple. I don't want to recite a litany of them. You know it and I know it. We're privileged because of our background, our connections, that we will not be tampered with. Others aren't. We aren't examples that actually prove the contrary. The fact that we survive and can criticize proves that others not so well connected can't. They are the real India.
Well, Karan, as a sensitive, thinking human being, the suffering of any Indian concerns me. As they say, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for all of us. I don't want to get into a debate on that because that's not the subject of our discussion.
Absolutely.
So I will keep that aside. That is something that should be within our scope of vision, but it's not part of what we're discussing today about India and the United States and what Kamala Harris had to say.
Can I then come back to what we're discussing? How do you view the relationship between the two countries over the remaining 3.25 years of the Biden presidency? And I'll tell you why I ask. Because there is a perception both in American Congress, in the American media, and in some sections, not all, some sections of the Democratic Party, that the trends that I've described are going to accelerate and proliferate. And therefore, the question marks over India's democratic status will grow. Do you think that will increasingly worry the Biden administration? After all, he's not Trump. He doesn't ignore these things. Or do you think subtle but more persistent pressure will be put on us to step back? Because that's a fault line, isn't it?
To be frank, Karan, I don't believe the Biden administration is putting India front and center in all that it does when it comes to its view of the world. That's the first point. The second point is that the domestic agenda of the Biden presidency and all the problems it has to fix within America, I don't want to sound complacent or, look at them, or I'm not being patronizing, but they have a very, very populated canvas of issues that they have to discuss, resolve, build consensus domestically. Look at the divisions within Congress. Look at the difficulties that he's had trying to push forward bills. Look at the question of immigration. Look at the question of the handling of COVID. They have so many issues on the canvas, on the plate, to resolve and to alleviate as far as the American people are concerned. So let's not get into this whole navel gazing about, how they are looking at India and where the relationship is going in the last 3 to 4 years. If you ask me, and I don't have a crystal ball in front of me, but I would certainly say that this relationship, the strategic convergence in the relationship between India and the United States, is not diminished in any way because of all that you have referred to and all the statements that may or may not have been made.
I think it's only important that you should have the last word. Despite the concerns that I raised, particularly when we were talking about AUKUS and the Quad, the strategic relationship is not diminished in any way. I think those were your precise words, although I'm repeating it from memory. I thank you, Mrs. Rao, for this interview. It was fascinating talking to you. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Karan.